Now that we've defined exactly what the mobile viewport is, we need to discuss how to control them. Currently, there are two mechanisms for overriding the user agent's default viewport. You can either use the viewport meta tag or the @viewport CSS rule. Since they both use similar syntax, I'm going to show you code examples for each and then describe their effects on the viewports. The meta viewport tag appears in the head of your HTML and has two basic parts: name, which is viewport, and content, which will contain the properties and values you wish to set for the viewport itself. The @viewport rule can appear anywhere in your CSS that you want, but since it can affect media queries, it's recommended that you place it prior to any media queries in your styles. Most designers place it near the top of their styles as one of, if not the very first rule. The syntax is similar to the meta viewport tag. You simply declare an @viewport rule and then populate it with the properties that you wish to control. Now that we have the basics of the syntax down, let's examine the individual properties that you can control. As we set viewport properties, we'll examine a site optimized for mobile screen sizes to see how the mobile browser reacts to changes to its default viewport. First, I want to explore controlling viewport width, which is arguably the most important viewport property to responsive design. As you can see, our layout is scaled down dramatically due to the default viewport settings. Now, if we change our viewport syntax to set the desired width to 320 pixels, you can see the site now displays at the desired width. Note that in the viewport meta tag syntax, you don't append px to the pixel value, while in the @viewport CSS syntax, you do. While a specific pixel value for width might be fine for some projects, remember that not all mobile screens are 320 pixels wide. If your website is using a fluid layout, you're going to want the layout to be based on the available screen width of the device and not limit the viewport to just one single size. To do that, we can use the property value device width. This value instructs the browser to set the viewport to the exact size as the available screen pixels. Setting this will remove any initial viewport scaling and allows you to create fluid layouts that adapt to multiple devices. Unless there's a reason to use a specific value for your viewports, this is the value I recommend you use for your responsive designs. Just as you can set width, you can also set the height of the viewport to either a specific value or by using the value device height. You probably won't need to control viewport height all that often, but you should know that the capability exists if you need it. You can also set the initial scale value for the property's content as well. It's easy to get this property confused with viewport width, so let's talk about exactly what it does. Initial scale controls the zoom factor of your content for the initial view of the page. Once the page has been viewed, the user is then free to scale the page at any factor they want. Now, it's important to note that this is independent of the viewport width. So if the initial scale is set to 2, for example, notice that our content is now scaled up to 200%, even though the width of the viewport remains unchanged. Setting the initial scale to 1 ensures that the content appears at 100% regardless of the viewport width. It's quite common to see people set width to device width and then also set initial scale to 1, but in reality, that's not really necessary. If you set the viewport width to device width, the browser automatically sets initial scale to 100%. In fact, on iOS devices, there's a bug with initial scale that affects pages when the orientation changes. So many people advise leaving initial scale off entirely unless you need to set the value to something other than 100%. In terms of syntax, notice that you use an integer to set the scaling factor and that meta viewport tags use the initial scale property, while @viewport uses zoom. The @viewport syntax currently also allows a percentage value as well, but since that may change in the future, you're safer just using a number. You can also control the range of scaling allowed by your site as well. Let's say you want to allow people to zoom in and out on your page content, but you do want to control just how much zooming they can do. By using the minimum and maximum scale properties, you can do just that. Now, in this example, I've set it up so that the minimum scaling is 1 and the maximum scaling is 2. Notice that the user can scale up to 200%, but can't scale down past 100%. In terms of syntax, there is a little bit of difference between the meta viewport tag and the @viewport syntax. In the meta viewport tag, you'll use the minimum and maximum scale properties, and a positive numeric value which indicates the scaling factor. In the @viewport syntax, you'll use the minimum and maximum zoom properties, and can use either a positive number or a percentage value. If you wish, you can turn scaling off entirely by using the user scalable property. This allows you to either enable or disable users' ability to zoom in and out on your page content, and is more commonly used actually for applications than websites. For the meta tag syntax, you'll use user scalable and values of either yes or no, and for @viewport, you'll use the user-zoom property, which will accept either the zoom or fixed values. Keep in mind that users are accustomed to having the ability to zoom in and out of web content. If you disable this for your site, you should have a clear and compelling reason to do so. These are just a few of the properties you can control when overriding a browser's default viewport. For a complete list of properties, and for more information on the syntax, visit the Safari HTML reference page for the viewport meta tag syntax, or the CSS device adaptation specification for more information on the @viewport rule. Now, it's important to note that support for the meta viewport tag is almost universal, while the @viewport syntax is still relatively new and largely unsupported for now. Existing support for the @viewport rule is also largely restricted to using vendor prefixes, so you'll need to be mindful of that if you choose to use that syntax. Adoption of @viewport is happening fairly rapidly, and the specification is maturing, so I expect we'll see full support for it in the very near future. Once this happens, we'll be able to choose exactly how we want to control user agents' viewports when creating responsive designs.